extensive knowledge, but I'll let him give a little bit more background on his knowledge in medical sciences and research and whatnot. But he's actually going to be talking about mummification today, so we can all give a little round of applause for Steven. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Do you need me to stand at the mic, or can you hear me without the mic? Because I have a pretty booming voice. Okay, that's fine. I just thought I'd double check. Okay, for those of you who don't know, I spent 35 years as a forensic pathologist with the New York City Medical Examiner's Office. And apart from my medical degree, I also have a PhD in forensic science and a master's degree in zoology and a fellowship in biochemistry. So I've had a few years of school, but Egyptology has been a lifelong passion for me ever since the age of 4, when I had my first introduction to mummies and x-rays. I mean, x-ray is phenomenal, but I mean, it's amazing I could even think at age of 4. But I have been fascinated, and every time my father would take me down to the museum, mummies, you know, this sort of thing. And so consequently, my job has also facilitated a great deal of travel around the world and working in many countries and experiencing a lot of different things, and I've taken advantage of every opportunity that's presented itself. So I'm here today to share with you my rudimentary knowledge of the subject. I am not an expert in any way. In another lifetime I might become an expert, but we'll see what happens, sort of thing in the near future. But anyway, today we're going to focus on mummification as a practice, but I'm going to give you a little preliminary information before we get into the actual mechanics of mummification. In the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties, it was considered that mummification had reached the apex of its existence, sort of thing. The very best mummies came from these periods. Initially, the process and techniques used by the ancient Egyptian embalmers for creating mummies differed according to the roles and social standings and the wealth of the individuals that they were embalming. And in the very beginning, mummification itself was the exclusive domain of pharaohs alone. As time progressed, the wealthy and the nobility were then included into that, and then anyone that could afford it could, seek this sort of preservation thing, again, depending upon what they could indeed afford. In most cases, most of them were lucky to get a shroud and a loaf of bread and perhaps a flagon of wine and be put into a sand pit in the desert, sort of thing. And there's evidence of that in many archaeological sites throughout Egypt. Probably more familiar is Deir el-Medina, which was the artisans' village that was established for the creation of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, and it existed for years and years and years. And most of the common graves were in a necropolis there. And the workers, basically, that's all they could, afford to do. They couldn't afford the rituals of elaborate tombs like burial, funerary possessions, as we saw in the tomb of King Tutankhamun. Anyway, the very earliest pharaohs, when they were interred were interred in two pits, which were essentially lined with stone and covered with a roof and stuff like that. And there's evidence at that time that they were even ritually sacrificing their servants to take and serve them in the next life, sort of thing. And that practice died out relatively soon. And that's when we see the beginnings of the creation of what are known as Shaktis. They were figures that were created with magical incantations and spells that allowed for that individual to perform a function on behalf of the deceased, sort of thing. So it was kind of nice for the living servants that you didn't have to have your throat cut any longer. So anyway, the social classes essentially were devised into three groups: pharaoh, royalty, and nobility. They could they could afford the very best that mummification could provide. Then the middle classes, which included scribes, army officers, doctors, etc., the professionals sort of thing, they could afford some type of thing. And generally, along with the mummification, they had, like pharaohs, when they came to the throne, they began the construction of their afterlife. Because for the Egyptians, living was a very important thing, but it was only temporary, whereas the afterlife was eternal, and it was going to be forever. So therefore, you started preparing from day one, this final resting place. And ultimately, at the very bottom of the scale are the peasantry, sort of thing, the lower classes. And they're the ones that essentially got the linen shroud, if they could even afford that, a loaf of bread and a flagon of wine, and then a nice pit in the desert. And that drying in the desert is probably what led ultimately to the idea of preserving the body as a whole for an existence in the afterlife, sort of thing, because they could see as the desert sands would erode over time, these bodies became exposed, and they could see the level of preservation that was extant. So therefore, they started looking at ways of creating this artificially, and that's what mummification is all about. So there are some key figures that take place, and among them are the gods themselves. There would be first and foremost Anubis and Osiris. Osiris being the lord of the underworld and king of it. He was the very first mummy that was ever created due to his battle with his brother Set, when he was entirely, he was murdered and he was entirely cut apart and his pieces scattered all over Egypt. And it took his wife and his wife's sister to reassemble him, and he therefore became the first mummy, and he was given the role of Lord of the Underworld. Anubis, of course, is the god responsible for embalming, oversaw the preparation of the body, and he would be the conductor of the deceased to the underworld and to the presence of Osiris, where there would be a whole bunch of steps here, which we'll discuss briefly, some of these things. So after these two key figures, there of course is the god Thoth and Ammit. Now Thoth is the god of wisdom, and he's also the creator of the sacred writing, the hieroglyphs sort of thing. So his presence is absolutely paramount, because the Egyptians believed in recording everything, and I will talk a bit more about that in a moment. And of course, Ammit is the devourer, and if Ammit got your soul at the Hall of Judgment, you did not bypass all the various stages that were put in place. Ammit was there to devour your heart, and therefore you cease to exist completely. And Ammit is probably one of the truly supernatural gods in the entire Egyptian pantheon, because there is no living creature like the other gods. Like Thoth, for example, he has the ibis head, so he takes the form of the ibis bird. And of course, Anubis has the head of the jackal. But Ammit has the head of a crocodile, the forefront of a lion, and the tail end of a hippopotamus, sort of thing. So there's nothing in the zoological world that would match that form in any way, shape, or form. So you can really say that this is truly a supernatural creature. But she is a goddess, and she is important. So anyway, the ancient Egyptians believed primarily that the soul had 6 parts, but scholars have identified up to 9. But over time, many of these components became collapsed and unified into other forms, sort of things. So I'll mention some of the others as we go through, but the ones that we're going to focus on right now is the Ren, which means the name. The name was the most important element to an Egyptian, because the name was both either spoken or written in some form. It basically helped to guarantee your immortality, sort of thing. And one of the most famous, this is where we are right now. So I will just come back to that, but I wanted to get to this because this is a representation of the wren. And this is a famous one because this is Tutankhamun. The first one is his name, Tutankhamun. The next one is his throne name or prenomen, which is Nekhupuri. And you can see the Kefir beetle in the center. The beetle, of course, is a symbol in Egyptology of longevity and eternity, sort of thing. So it's a very important thing. A pharaoh could have up to 6 or 7 different names when he ascended the throne. Most had a minimum of at least 5. Tutankhamun was his actual given name, Tutankhaten to begin with, and later changed to Tutankhamun when the gods of Amun were reestablished. So anyway, we have the name, and after that, we have the Ka and the Ba, and they're the two most important aspects of the, just want to get into this here. Okay, there's the Ba. That's a representation of the Ba. It's a bird with a human form, and the Ka is essentially just symbolized by 2 upraised hands. So there's some very important iconography that's available in the study of Egyptology that shows statues with these things. They're also symbolic of, the hands represent one of the goddesses. I'm trying to think, it might be Nephthys. Don't quote me on that one. I should have double checked that one. This is basically how it was because there was no other pictorial that represented that particular aspect. But the Khat is the actual physical being and of the living or the deceased. And whereas the Ka and the Ba are released upon death, and they are reunited after the mummification process and after many ritual type things to form another form, which is the Ak. And the Ak was the transfigured spiritual entity that survived death, and it then mingled with the gods. So this is the reunification, the Ka and the Ba, and it takes place in the Hall of Judgment. So it's the reanimation of the mummy into, again, a being. So if there are any questions at any time, please don't hesitate to interrupt me. Yes?
Are you able to share your slides with us?
Yes, I'm going to present a hard copy of both my lecture notes and the slide material in the library there. So, yeah, okay?
I can also put them online as well for everybody.
Oh,
on the Google
terrific,
Drive. Yeah.
Ashley, good. So I'll email you those files, okay? Great. But I just want to go back here and discuss this part of this because this again refers to the wren. Originally, the name of a pharaoh or an important dignitary was contained in palace walls, which were known as the Sarak. It preceded the cartouche. The cartouche came along later, and what it was the shen, which is a religious symbol, which was like a knotted rope, and it became elongated to accommodate the symbology or hieroglyphic symbology of the pharaoh's name, sort of thing. It was only called a cartouche by the French because of its resemblance to the cartridges they were carrying in their ammunition pack. So it goes back, to the Napoleonic period when Napoleon, had the Battle of the Nile with Lord Nelson and stuff like that. So that's where cartouche originates. But prior to that, the Egyptians would have just referred to it as the name or Sarak. And the Sarak essentially was, again, these hieroglyphic symbols, but it was usually contained within some sort of block-like structure. In the gallery upstairs, there's a pictorial of the Narmer palette, which is of King Narmer or King Menes, because there's some scholars think that they may be one and the same person. And if you look at it, the name of the pharaoh is in like a little block at the top between 2 figures or 2 symbols at the very top. And that is the Sarak. And it meant to be enclosed by palace walls. But palace walls were not just the pharaoh's palace. They referred to the country as a whole, sort of